Okay, so now I'm ready to start admitting some students. I usually wait until at least two students are in the waiting room and I admit them both so that there's never a time when it's just me and one student. And they'll start to pop up here in participants. You can see it's just me right now. Before I start admitting anyone, I always make sure I have my tabs open. So I've got the Schoology tab open I've got a Spotify tab, and you can tell it's playing here. Even if I wasn't wearing my headphones, I know that there was audio coming through. And then I like to share my screen, but I'm going to go into advanced and share only the sound. You can also share the sound with your screen by clicking this button when you share your screen, but I'm going to share with sound. And then you can say, you see I'm sharing my computer sound, and I can stop that at any time. And that way, as students come in, they have something that they're listening to. Another thing I want to check is my chat settings before I start admitting students. Right now, it's set to they can only chat with me as the host. That's what I like to start off with. Unless you've got some really good expectations, you might not want this. And also, even if you have somebody come in who you're not sure about, you definitely want it to be set to host only. Okay. So now you can see I have somebody who's popped into my waiting room. I've opened this up in the participants menu. And you can see that they have what looks like a username here of some sort, where it's like a last name and maybe some initials. But maybe there's nobody on my role who has that. We're kind of play acting here, but normally I'd have a whole bunch, and I'd be admitting the ones who were obviously on my role and marking them present. But then if I run into something like this, where I'm pretty sure that this is one of my students, but they're sharing a device and somebody else was using some official username here, what I would do is I would first make sure that I'm assessing my risk. So how old is my Zoom link? Is it possible that this is not my student? If it's likely my student, what I like to do is I like to press mute all to mute all of my students, and I uncheck this box. That way, if I let somebody in who's not my student, they won't be able to unmute and say something. The other thing I like to check is make sure my chat is set to host only so that I can communicate with this person, and it's probably my student. So I'm going to hit admit since they're probably my student. As soon as their little box pops up over here, I'm going to be paying attention, because if they aren't my student, I don't want them to be turning their video on. And the very first thing I do is I go to the dot in the corner, and I choose rename up at the top. And I usually do it much faster than I'm doing this right now, because I want to make sure that we don't even hardly see that name. And then I'll mention either by unmuting or by typing in the chat to that one particular person that I want them to please rename themselves. And that particular person probably already knows how to rename themselves. So because we've been over it a bunch of times, but if they chat back and say they don't know how, I say click on your picture, click on the three dots and choose rename. Most devices that will work, and they can usually figure it out. If they can't figure it out, you can always ask them who they are, and then you can rename them. You can ask them to turn their video on for a minute to wave at you. But you want to be careful about interacting with people who you're not sure who they are. So make sure that you figure out who they are quickly. Let's look at another example. Okay, so you can see now I've got somebody who's joining, but they have a really offensive racial slur as is part of their username. So I don't want to admit that and even show that to my students just for a second. So I have this person here who's maybe trying to cause havoc, or maybe somebody, or it's possible it's one of your students and somebody else in their house is playing a prank on them and put that in there too. So who knows why that's like that, but I don't want to admit them. But if I press remove, what will happen is this person will not be able to come back into this meeting ever again. They are permanently banned if you remove them from the meeting. So if you're using the same meeting links over and over again, this could really cause a problem if this is one of your students. The other thing to consider is no one can see this besides you, right? If you're the only host, you're the only person who can see this name in the waiting room. So what you could do is you could instead chat to everyone in the waiting room. Some things to realize here. students can't rename themselves while they're in the waiting room. Some students don't know how to rename themselves at all unless they're in a Zoom meeting, because if they've chosen to save their name, it will remember the name they used last time no matter what. And it's really hard to get into the settings to change your name. Some of this might be fixed when we have student accounts, but I anticipate that will take a little while for everybody to get on board and logged in correctly with. So if you're going to chat to them in the waiting room, I usually say something like, if you are one of my students, please send me an email or Schoology message. So that way, at least I have an email address, or I can tell which user it is from the Schoology message, and then maybe I can arrange, if they can't figure out how to change their name, like by dropping out of the waiting room, changing their name, and rejoining. A lot of times, if I do this, that is what happens. If I send that to the waiting room, I'll see this name drop off my waiting room, and then they'll come back in with the right name. But some students aren't technically able to do that. So if they get stuck in this situation, you can arrange a time later and do an individual Zoom and invite an administrator and a parent, and then have them come in, and then you can rename them for them, and then it should remember that for the next time. But this is a nice way. Just keep in mind that they can't chat back to you. They generally can't change their name in the waiting room, and if you remove them, and it's permanent. Here's another common situation. I have a student who's already here, already in the meeting, and yet they're showing up here again. This is something to be aware of, because a lot of times the people who are coming to disrupt your class are aware of who's in class. Maybe they're a student in class. Maybe they have information given to them by a student in class. So if it's a student who's already here or a student who rarely attends Zoom meetings, just be cautious, because it might be somebody who you don't want. So again, you can use the mute all and uncheck this. If you ever want to turn this back on, you can go back in and check the box and do mute all again. But if you admit this person, I would definitely immediately ask them to change their name, or before you admit them, you can also chat with the person who's already here with the same name and say, are you trying to join again? Are you having technical difficulties? Because that happens a lot too. I have students who are trying to join with multiple devices, sometimes just trying to join with the same device, who are having a hard time getting in. They'll show up down here and they'll show up here. Sometimes they'll show up here twice. Those are all technical difficulties, and they shouldn't be removed from class for technical difficulties. But there are occasions as well where students are coming in using other people's names who are in class. So be careful when that happens. That is a good sign that the student is probably not in your class. So I'm going to admit this student. I've got my mute all set. I've got chat set to this. And I might start querying them directly now, because now I can chat with them directly. If they keep asking you to if they can unmute, then that is a sign that perhaps that is not who you want in your class. What I have done in the past is said, okay, that's fine, I'll talk to you after class. Usually they're not patient enough. If you're Zoom bombing, you don't want to stick around for a while. I've heard of other teachers who have also done things like they have asked them to, or like left them in the waiting room for a while, and if they're really your student, they'll hang around, but usually Zoom bombers don't have the patience for that. So the other thing is, when you're on mute all and you're not allowing participants to unmute themselves, you want to press ask to unmute, and then they're going to have to press unmute on their end in order to talk to you. If you don't have this set, if you have it set like this, then a student can unflip the mute button, and you can mute them back, but they can flip it, and you can just sort of fight back and forth here. So this is really your best option if they keep unmuting and you don't want them to, is to press mute all and uncheck this. The same is not true for video. So if they start their video and you stop their video, when they press start video again, they will get an error that says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. So if I stop somebody's video, they can't turn it back on unless I choose ask to start video from the ... Okay? So You can ask to unmute. You can ask to start video. Muting works differently than video. So that's important to understand as well. If you are pretty sure that this is the wrong person, you can directly remove them, or you can put them in the waiting room. What happens if you're pretty sure that you're onto them and you've explained that and you put them in the waiting room, you'll see them disappear, and then somebody will probably reappear with a new name because they still have access to the link. There is a way to lock the meeting, but I do not recommend it because it disadvantages students who have poor internet connections. So from this ... in the participants, you can ask everyone to unmute. You can mute participants on entry. You can also turn off the allowing participants to unmute themselves or turn that on. You can allow participants to rename themselves. You can play a sound when someone joins or leave. You can enable a waiting room. You should always have that enabled, and you can lock the meeting. When you choose lock meeting, no one can add themselves. So if anybody drops off in the middle of the Zoom, they will not be able to get back in. If anybody shows up late, they won't be able to get in. So that's something that I would avoid doing.